Thank you very much, and thank you for setting the scene, pointing out we are the last one before the break.
Make it long.
Yeah, this one is going to be a good one, though. And so just quickly, so you know where I'm coming from, I'm running the Emerging Payments Association in Asia. So we're really having a regional conversation on what's happening in payments and bringing our members to the table to find common answers, best practice, and speak to regulators. So our focus is policy and advocacy. And it's my first Intersekt, so I'm very excited to be here, and I've had some great conversations already. And how could I not be excited with this master panel I have here? And when we had a chat before, I also said we need to have quite a high tempo, and we needed to be really sharp, because we have some of the sharpest people in Australian fintechs in the room. But before we dive into it, I'm going to do a quote from Albert Einstein that I think that many of you have heard before. And that is, if I just had 1 hour to save the world, I would spend the first 55 minutes in defining the problem. And then I would go and find the solution. And from our sitting and observing a lot of companies, both small and big, I think they are spending too little time on defining the problem. They're running down this innovation route to find down, oh, maybe we should have gone there, or maybe we should have partnered here. And it's really important. So hence, the first question to the panel is going to be, when we're talking about the payments experience and we want to make payments into a good experience, what problem are we actually solving? So, Christian Westerlind Wigström, I was going to do that with the perfect accent because I'm actually also Swedish, but then I lost it.
It was a very good Swedish accent.
Thank you. CEO and co-founder of Minova. Also want to say congratulations on winning the award for the best FinTech organization of the year.
Thank you.
So, on to the problem. How would you define it?
The problem is not a single one, because it will take different forms depending on what exact flow you're talking about. But the overarching one is one in which increasingly consumers in all our forms, whether it's us here in our more sort of civilian lives or people who don't care about payments ever, other than when they do them 7 times a day, is that we generally come to think of payments as being part of the experience of the product or service that we're buying. So previously it was probably fine to think of the good and service you bought, and that could be good or bad, and then the payments experience being separate. But increasingly, a problem for merchants and others who make services and goods available is that the payments part of the experience is now brought into, it's integrated into the experience of the good and service. So unless you have a really nice way to interact with your client on everything, from how you describe your product to how you explain who you are to how you get paid for selling this thing, I think you're going to lose out to others who are better at that. So payments as an experience is ultimately going to be making payments less and less of an experience. No one is interested in payments. I know I don't like handing over something I don't want to part with. And the merchant knows that because I don't like it, they don't really like that experience either. So the problem is, how can we make payments less like payments? And the reason it matters is because all of us interact with this every day, all the time. And we know what happens when something good comes on the market. We all tap and go. We all do the thing that is the easiest. And all of a sudden, the one who has tap and go is where you go, rather than the one who says, I take cash only.
So with one sentence, the problem is saving time or not making it an experience?
The problem is that we all expect and deserve better. And unless you deliver on that, you're going to lose to those who do.
Yep, yeah, I think that's right. I read some stats on about 75% of customers would leave a company if they don't have a good experience. So if we have that experience being the payments in it, it's really important to get that piece right. But Ian, you are the consultant at the group here. You are probably very well used to defining problems, I hope at least, working for ThoughtWorks. So how would you define this?
Yeah, I'd agree with Christian around sort of the pain of paying is something that you really want to eliminate as much as possible and really focus on how do you make that either an experience that disappears into the background entirely, or if you can add value in that experience, that it should be really demonstrable to that end consumer. So in terms of, I'm very glad to say, like, being part of ThoughtWorks and like 10,000 consultants globally, sort of canvas broadly, like what are the sort of the pain of paying that people have across our consultants. So I got about 400 responses. Like a high proportion of them are actually around like what product managers in sort of either their e-commerce experiences or sort of payment experiences at the end stage would perceive to be like sort of incidental UX experiences, but a lot of these sort of compound into becoming really frustrating experiences. And I think that's really only been exacerbated over the last couple of years where the conventions of how we pay have changed and there are more options of how we pay. And so all of those sort of grains of sands or paper cuts are sort of adding up and really frustrating people now in terms of it's not particularly consistent, the experience that you have between different contexts when you're paying. And so those things should be probably addressed more concisely and looked at like how do you look at that more holistically and go, are we really improving this experience to, from a merchant benefit, actually get to the conversion, but from a customer benefit, they actually make that purchase and go, I felt really good about that.
So if I turn that into a sentence, could I say the problem is that the experience is not good enough?
I think it's that the focus of like where like product managers are looking to improve the experience is not like, there are probably more hygiene factors that they could look at first before trying to overload added value features on top first.
Okay, yeah. That sounds good, defining. Mark has flown in from London, so welcome to Australia.
Thank you very much.
He's from Currency Cloud, and congratulations to your license here in Australia.
Yeah, we recently got our license a couple of months ago now, and we're not far off getting our Singapore license as well, so we're coming hard into the APAC region.
Fantastic, and I read, yes, recapping on who they are, the gentlemen, so I didn't get anything wrong, and Forbes actually said about Currency Cloud that they are the secret pipes behind most fintechs. So that was a very cool quote you had on your webpage. The problem?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with everything these guys have said. I think the way I would have a slight nuance on what was said was more that essentially no one's actually making a payment, right? No one's going somewhere to do a payment. They're doing something else. And the payment is ancillary to that. And you've got to make sure that that capability is either invisible or completely embedded within that process, which is essentially what you guys said. And I think part of the challenge comes that you have businesses where their core capability is selling a widget and they're trying to make a payment experience for somebody. And I think actually where you'd be better off is leaning on the experts on creating that so it can become invisible and it can become part of the experience. And I think maybe part of the problem is that the end providers of those services don't necessarily think as well about that problem as they could do. So I think the problem is how do you enable customers to pay seamlessly in an environment?
You want to add something?
Yes, please. So Camilla has given us right, by the way, to interrupt each other and jump into the conversations because generally it's more exciting. Just two things. In an earlier conversation that we had, I think you made a great point, Mark, that I didn't want us to lose, which is no one wakes up in the morning and says, today I want to pay. Today I want to part with money. What you want is always that other thing. You want to buy something, you want to get something else in return. So payment really is something we all actually want to be without. It just happens to be something we need to go through in order to get the thing we do want. So I think that's one core thing that, as we from Manuva certainly position have been talking about for a long time, is that the best maneuver is sort of a dead maneuver for some people in the sense that we exist just so far in the background that even though we wear aqua, you don't have to worry about what we do because it just happens. But the other point I think is that also picking up what you're saying, in lots of other areas of doing business, we're used to thinking of that as something you outsource. Like, you don't start a business and say, today I'm going to build my air conditioning unit myself. No, you get someone to build your air conditioning unit for you. You also don't say, today I'm going to build my own email server. You get someone else to do that and you insource that instead. Payments ought to be exactly the same thing. It's not something that a lot of us have this intuitive or even the intuition or the resource base to build very well. So you ought to do that with someone who does that and only that so that you power the thing that you're actually in the market to do.
I have to disagree a little bit, because not that I love paying, but I think a good experience is not just anymore just doing what you think it's doing something more. If I'm going to talk about it and I'm going to be out, it's something more. It's not just being fast, it saves me time, or it just does that extra little bit more. So I would actually like to stretch the experience. Is maybe not, we're going to come back with this with invisible experience or non-experience, or what we should call it, don't know the difference. But first, just looking also at when we're developing the best experience. I think you sort of touched on that, all of you already. What makes it difficult for you to deliver the best experience now? Is it anything that stands in your way? Yeah, I can go to Ian first, maybe.
I think so what I talked before, I think a lot of payments experiences within organizations sort of get built up in sedimentary layers. It's just, and it doesn't get cleared out. It sort of continues to exist. And so a lot of the time sort of either accepted wisdom of how something should be in place remains, and therefore that's how it gets implemented, or it has to work through large parts of the organization to change those conventions and make it simpler. As I think we all know, it's like making something really elegant and simple isn't an easy task, even though the end result ends up looking something like it doesn't exist at all. So I think like a lot of that isn't necessarily like the effort to actually sort of clear the decks a little bit is often something that organizations don't really want to go about, and so it just gets another layer added on top, which then it can become a substandard experience over time.
And Mark, in your effort to enhancing the experience, do you have anything that's limiting you or slowing you down?
Yeah, look, I think from my side, my background, is predominantly in international payments, and that's a very complex area. You're stitching together different payment systems, and you're essentially sitting across verification, money in, money out, how you give customers choice on how they're sending money in, how they're paying it out, how you're making people feel the pressure of verification when they should be, i.e. they're a bad actor, but not when they're not. So I think over the years, the barriers that have been in the way of it have got lower from the point of view of technology has enabled a smoother experience. And I think it continues to evolve in that way. I think probably one of the biggest barriers that we have as a non-bank provider is the infrastructure in some regions. How that's evolving, how that's coming about. A good example I always talk about is you see providers from Australia and the UK where actually the digital payment infrastructure for locals is not too bad, and it's improving. There's open banking and all that good stuff that's enabling. You pick that up and take it to the UK, to the US, and think, right, we can do that. That infrastructure is just atrocious. And so you have to think of different ways about how you can facilitate our aim is ultimately to get to real-time payments, right? Because it's where you can shorten that speed, that time, and make it easier and cheaper for the customer. And so you've got to look at different ways of how you can do that. You then start to bring in multiple providers, so you can almost have like a closed loop network in an environment where there isn't a real-time payment capability. So I would say the barriers are getting lower. But there needs to be creativity about how you overcome barriers if they are there.
Yeah, that topic of interoperability is my favorite topic all the time, and how we need to have the standards, but also make sure we're not shutting certain players out. But I'll keep that for another discussion. Christian, do you want to add to how are you enhancing? Is it anything that's standing between you and the perfect experience?
Of course. As it'd be naive to think that what we have now is the best it will ever get. Part it's time and infrastructure that's available in where we operate. Knowing that they are getting better, the infrastructure is available. With Pay2 coming on, that is sort of removing the last bit of the Middle Ages out of the 21st century, and turning it into something that is truly quite great. In what you can do with it. And without the underlying infrastructure, we can try hard and we can do closed loop systems, and that does work. But we also know that closed loop systems sooner or later are sort of having a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and someone says, wait a minute, we don't really understand what you're doing. It seems a bit too avant-garde, let's bring it back to what we know. So that can be an issue, and that, I guess, speaks to the second one, is infrastructure isn't just technology, infrastructure is also regulation. And infrastructure at some more far-fetched level is also education. So I guess problems can be of different natures. One problem is you have a problem, you have a headache, you want a pill to get the headache to disappear. But problem can also be that you're just at a suboptimal equilibrium. You might think you're fine until you realize, oh, I can do this other thing. It's so much better. I had no idea. And it's sort of not a problem in a traditional sense, but it's a problem once you understand what you could do instead. And so payments fall sometimes in between those two. It's probably problem in the first way when it comes to international payments, because most people think, oh God, it takes 7.5 years for money to show up somewhere else, and by then it's only half of it left because the rest was in fees. But problems in that second way of, like, probably most people think direct debit seem to work most of the time until you do pay two, and you think, oh my God, I was fine with this for years. But there's something else I think that we probably should touch on quickly, which is this is all. I think we've defined a problem in a quite a cool way, slightly differently, but all coming to something that sounds cohesive. But it's the magnitude of this as well. Given that payments is so ubiquitous, this is not just something that should matter to a few people in a small number of rooms. This is something, because I certainly know that by the time I meet a person in the morning, unless it's my wife or my children, they have transacted. They've gone on a bus, they've bought a coffee. At every instance, there is an opportunity for improvement. So the collective impact of some of these improvements could be massive, and some of it even regards just trust. If payments require a lot of trust, that's either between people, between systems, and if you can create that trust, I think what you'll do with it and how you increase exchange of ideas and goods and services, we can be totally utopian on that point.
It's actually funny because you're segueing without knowing into what I was going to say. So I look a lot at the wallets in Southeast Asia and how they are used and what they mean for people there, and we don't have it here. And recently, Meta and Jio in India launched this shopping list on WhatsApp. And I felt like that's what I want. And the segue is that I was such a late adopter to WhatsApp that it was ridiculous. All my friends kept on asking, why don't you use WhatsApp? And I was like, but I have messaging. And now I am a late adopter. That's why I do this job really well, because I understand the slow people in the back of the line. But Ian, why do you think, I think super apps and that whole experience you get in a space where you trust and where you spend a lot of time, why is that so slow to come to Australia?
I think there's this market in particular. I think Australia has had a rich history of introducing payments innovations, and so as I said, there's this broad range of payments experiences that already exist in this market, and so there's as you've said.
I have to say, have we? I have to question that a little bit.
So I would say, so for your example, in terms of WhatsApp, there's a lot of things that are good enough until people experience better. So I think that exists in the Australian market. There is a lot of good enough, or people perceive them to be good enough experiences. Whereas in the other markets, such as China, Indonesia, Malaysia, so Thoughtworks has had the opportunity to work with Gojek and Grab in the Malaysian and Indonesian markets. You've got a combination of giant population sizes, so scale, so it makes it valuable to solve these types of problems, but you also have had a giant leap forward in terms of that experience. So as soon as those types of experiences were introduced, they were even beyond 10 times better than what was previously available. So I think for something like that to be successful in Australia, that the value that needs to be created needs to be beyond 10 times better to get people to switch. As I sort of talked before around people get very settled into their payment conventions and where they shop and how they shop. So I think there's definitely opportunity in the Australia market. So seeing some of the players that CBA is pushing to buying e-commerce startups. We've got examples like Finder where they're pulling in embedded finance experiences into their app. We've also potentially got the influx of Cash App entering this market. So I think there's opportunities for those types of things to particularly establish, but I think they really need to then contextualize the experience for the Australian market to go, what is it that will be the really coring strategy of that super app that will pull in more people into it? Because at the moment there isn't really, as we've sort of seen with Revolut, there wasn't, as a super app that has entered this market, there wasn't that coring superpower that brought more people that they could then build these added services around.
Yeah, you almost have to fall into it, or the benefits have to be really obvious. Because actually, did you know this? Wheels on the suitcases came in 1972, and the wheels has been invented for 5,000 years.
Yeah.
Wheels on payments is something I speak about. If you want to know why that was, you can come and speak to me afterwards on my theory. Mark, what was I going to speak to you about? I was going to speak to you, what do you think will happen in the B2B space? Because we've seen a lot in B2C. What do you see?
Yeah, I think, interestingly, one of the things I'd say, I think maybe why it's a slower burn into Australia is in those markets where you see the super apps. Those guys kind of skipped desktop, and they were straight on your mobile phone, and then you're kind of your limit. You know, if you can get yourself on someone's front home screen. I mean, I've got 184 updates to do on my apps. That's how many I've got on my phone. But I very rarely scroll past my front page, right? So if you can get on there and you can get into one that's regularly used, then I think that is really where the secret's at. And it's interesting because we talked about payments, you know, kind of employing experts at payments to do the stuff for you, and that's essentially what super apps are doing, right? They're apps that have got high engagement from customers in the first place, and then they're building around that. So, you know, where I see potential for that kind of experience to start to play out are two different areas. One, the likes of Xero or something like that, where they're actually creating marketplace and you're just bringing in API layers for people, and actually it becomes a compelling proposition to use that trusted source to find your provider. And it fits really well with what Currency Cloud, as an example, do in terms of being the invisible pipes, because you aren't presenting as that. But I think another area that I think will be a very interesting proposition as fintech becomes a larger portion of the environment is whether in the SME space you see banks themselves becoming super apps for different financial services, and opening up their brand and their brand pull to better API experiences provided by fintechs to give better experiences to their customers. And I think it's particularly relevant in the SME space because it's so underinvested in by banks.
It's interesting. So it's almost going back to that problem. It's not just defining the problem, it's also defining where do we spend our time and who do we trust, and then to integrate the problem solving in where we already have your eyeball attention.
Well, because you can also then present to, I always used to say there's no one that knows me better than, I'm not going to say my mum, but it's no one knows me better than my phone company and my bank, right? They know who I'm calling and they know and they know where I'm spending my money. And so you can then become much more bespoke as an experience about going, actually, you need this service, but you just don't know yet. Yeah. And bringing in payments as an example, and that capability that they might need within their environment.
I think I was just on the SMB space. I think it's really interesting around that. So you mentioned Xero. I think the super apps in China, for example, that people do multi-home across like the Tencent and the Alibaba app because they're two closed loop ecosystems. Yep. So people have to be on both of those apps in order to pay people in both of those. For the SME space, I think it's really interesting because like Xero, MYB, or Intuit, people don't multi-home across them if you're an SME because like that's where your accountant lives. So it's a very natural like gravity point for all that data to exist. Like for CDR, I often thought like the small business market is actually much more applicable for around CDR because as a small business, you're much more likely to have much more diverse payment options that you're using outside your single bank. So yeah, I really see like the accountancy firms that really have an opportunity as well in the SME space.
I think that really brings us back to what we're talking about essentially is embedded finance, which is, again, the reason we call it embedded is because it's not the main deal. It's just disappears as part of the thing you're actually wanting to do, which brings us maybe back to the point you said earlier where you disagreed with me earlier. You say, surely there's more to payments than just making money move. And I agree with that, but the true payments component is the making money move, but then you can make it happen in a way that allows for a greater experience overall, which is generally because you're wanting to do something else. So whether that is inside your accounting software package or, I mean, you said it's your bank and your telco knows you best. Imagine if you brought them two together, you know, they know you really well. You can create embedded experiences overall where payments is just something that happens in the background. Just like you're not going out that I want to use electricity today. It's something that you use because you're doing something else.
But you have some of those merchants also that see as they taking the payments, even if they're done making the payments, it's still an experience that could be positive. I think that's where I'm coming from. Yep. I'm not just thinking about Monova, I'm thinking also about where, even if I don't see it's you, I'm thinking of that interface is also the payments.
Yes, but it's not, it doesn't, it of course can be positive, but generally it's positive because the payments component of it is smaller and the other bits are bigger. So you get more data, you get better ways of interacting with your customers. The payments part generally is smaller, the better it is, because you can make more room for other things.
So talking about invisible payments and friction, so I shared this when we prepared for this panel where we had a chat, and I said, as you might have noticed, I don't love invisible payments. And I have my 11-year-old daughter who had no friction at all when she shopped at Amazon. And attention to detail, I noticed when it was 12, the 12th package arrived home, and I was like, what is all those Amazon packages? So what do you think about that customer protection if we really make payments invisible? Where do you think that, could that slow innovation down or?
Well, I mean, clearly in that case, payments were not invisible given that we're talking about it on stage in front of lots of people. So what it means, invisibility doesn't mean that there is no control. It means there's something you don't have to think about. But you had to think about this because clearly that payment experience was not invisible. It was maybe too smooth in that instance. So invisible means you don't need to worry about it. So you need to have controls involved. You need to have consent. I mean, think about whether it's pay to or CDR or whatever it is. Core to all of those things, creating trust and earning trust is that you have authorizations around it and that people believe, I know what's going to happen when I interact with the system. I understand that if I leave the system to deal with it on my behalf, it's going to do it the way I would do it myself. So look, the fact that anyone can make a payment isn't necessarily a great thing, particularly not with someone else's money, even if it's your mother's.
Yeah, like the control element is really, like when we did the analysis for the MPP for Pay 2, I think like that was a really important point that people, the current direct debit scheme, people don't have the control of when those payments are going out. People don't know when those payments are going out, even if like some of the neos have done sort of scraping the transactions and can sort of predict it historically. It doesn't give people any control. They still have to then chase the merchant. So I think when you give people those controls, they can take action retroactively and go, actually, no, that payment's not right. So if you take an Uber and it cancels on you and it takes the payment, you can engage very quickly with Uber and go, no, don't charge me that $10. That person did not turn up, and immediately that money is refunded. You can have some retroactive control on that. So I think like those are the things that if you are going to implement any sort of automation in that space, you do then have to provide very clear, like how do you take action on that? How do you automate that? And it doesn't become something that is then an onerous paper-based, like call center-based system in order to be able to retake control of it.
I think it's really interesting actually because we talk about trying to make things quicker and smoother, and I remember when Apple Wallet came out and going, why would anyone use that? And now I never have my wallet with me. And my biggest frustration now is actually when you tapped your phone, you've got to wait about 5 seconds just to make sure that it's cleared before you can leave the shop, and that's my big frustration now, which is a real first world problem. But those controls you talk about, it's interesting you mentioned Amazon because in Europe and the UK, PSD2 brought in strong customer authentication, and lots of companies struggled with that concept. What we talked about is how do you make it smoother? How do you make sure customers aren't abandoning carts and all that good stuff? And so companies were struggling with how they were going to do that. And you look at Amazon. Amazon said, we're not going to do it. We'll just refund them if it's fraudulent. So there's kind of, they saw that friction could become they put the control somewhere else, right? But they put the onus on you and the pain on you if there is a fraudulent transaction, which is not necessarily a good thing. You look at some of the, I think it comes down to how you create those controls in there that are pretty seamless. A good example is Monzo in the UK. Its two-factor authentication is on the app on your phone most of the time when you're doing on, you've always got your phone with you, right? And so it's just a very quick message where you put your code in very quickly. So I think creating controls around it that are pretty seamless to the transaction as well is possible. And so the question is, morally, are you obliged to do it? I think that's kind of where it starts to come in.
No, I like that. I like that. A little bit of friction. It might sound like I spend money, like I need somebody to control it for me. No, anybody that does eBay purchases when they've been drinking wine, don't do that. Anyway, I keep on looking to see if I have a time somewhere. Okay, can I, how much to? I'm so sorry. The audience wants to hear a quick question here?
We're only keeping them from coffee, it's fine.
Okay, really short. If you really need to leave, you can leave, but I will know who you are. So just want to check, if one thing that you would like to happen within the next year until you're here next time, or if you want to take a vision, something you want to see in 10 years' time. No. Taking either or, depending on what you want to answer. Something you want to happen now that we can talk about next year when we're invited back, or 10 years. Who wants to go first? Okay. Ian.
So I think I'd really like to see the ACCC's decision on Apple's NFC chip revisited on the wallet. So I think it's the 2017 ruling around like this was an emerging innovation. I think we're all past that now. I think Apple have demonstrated that this is an established technology and it should be opened up broader to other wallets. Because as we've seen within the App Store, Apple have a tendency to start to become the monopoly on those types of conventions. And although Apple do offer very good experience in those, I think there are opportunities for the fintechs in Australia to give a much more local flavour and to introduce innovation in that space.
That was a good one. I really liked that one. Perfect. Mark?
From my side, it'd be, particularly in the Australian market, would be just much more adoption of an acceleration of open banking and more so NPP for international payments as well. So just small little
Is that a 10-year one or what?
We have a whole project on that one. So I agree. I want to see movement in that space. Christian?
I think over the next 5 to 10 years, my prediction is that we will have all online sort of consumer type transactions going to happen on some form of pay to. I think all other forms of payments are going to look crazy. They're going to look arcane, uncontrolled, slow, and just like the 1750s.
That's something I want to see too. So thank you, gents. This has been really interesting. As you see, time fly by. Thank you, audience, for staying. I appreciate it. And thank you, Intersekt, for having us.
They were really scared of you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.